The total of all the sacks, we found most of the pieces of 3 complete people, all male, at varying degrees of decomposition.
Police would eventually find the remains of 15 victims lured back to the home of this mild-mannered civil servant.
I was asked to go to the police station to photograph Dennis Nielsen because he had some injuries to his body which were thought may be relevant if he had murdered someone and they'd struggled. These injuries could have been caused by the victim. He seemed a very pleasant man. He was chatting away while I was photographing him. He asked me about my job and the camera, and he was just making polite conversation, I think.
Nielsen's crimes sent the media into a frenzy, but not even the most sensational tabloid hype came close to the forensic horror captured by Ian Bradshaw's dispassionate lens.
Obviously, there was a lot of press interest in the case as news was leaked out that he was claiming to have killed 16 people, and there was a large gathering of press outside. I was going in and out of the house getting things from my vehicle, and at one point a group of press photographers made a comment about a checkbook. They had a checkbook there and offered me the chance to fill in the figures myself, offering basically any amount of money I'd like for copies of my photographs. Not that they could have used them in the papers, I don't think, but I had to laugh because they hadn't seen what I had seen. They were just too horrific. No newspaper would have published what we'd seen in the house.
Police photography is almost as old as photography itself. Exactly 100 years ago, the Home Office made a grant of 19 shillings and 10 pence for chemicals and paper. The first police camera was in fact confiscated from a prisoner. Enthusiastic amateurs from the police ranks recorded the first 50 years or so of crime until civilians took over.
When I got to Scotland Yard for that first time, I was disappointed because they were still using equipment which had been in use for quite a few years. And as a new boy of the new professional photographers, if you like, it comes a little bit hard when you find that where you started work, they've got the cameras of yesterday. And I can remember very, very well, I don't know whether it was a wind-up or what, but the first job I did was a fatal accident on a road. It happened, but I had to go in there and photograph the scene, and I was given a half-plate camera with no shutter. It just had a lens and a cap. And I had to go like that.
Everything was done on cut film. There was no roll film used except for public relations exercises. We had a big half-plate camera using glass plates that was called the murder camera, and that had to be used for murders in those days. Everything was black and white. We had no transport. I'd have to ring the local Nick, hitch a lift in from one of their cars to the yard, get all the equipment packed up, organise a car to take me out to the scene. I can remember we used to get the pool driver, who actually I think knew more about how to photograph scenes than I did in the early days, used to actually take us out to the scene and sort of say, well, they usually stand there for one and there for that.
But a new sort of crime called for up-to-date equipment and techniques. Coming up next, the villains who ruled the East End, and the men who had to photograph the bloody consequences of their reign of terror. Bob Campbell's 20 years with the branch have taught him to handle horror just like any other professional assignment, with all its pressures and problems.
For a lot of waiting around, and so it might even rain, so I want to try and get this done before the rain comes and the light disappears.
After a late Friday night photographing a suicide, it's a Saturday evening call-out for something the Thames tide has brought in.
Hello? What are you doing?
There's been a macabre discovery among the debris on the Greenwich foreshore.
Basically, we're at the scene. There's a body down there on the actual foreshore. It's got all the hallmarks have been washed up. At the moment, we're just doing some general pictures just to show it in context of where it's actually ended up. Almost quite a pretty spot if it wasn't for the smell. Yeah, press door. It looks like the body's deteriorating, and one of the feet is actually completely missing as well. Mosquitoes. Alright, he's obviously got a bit of a severe injury to his head, but whether that's an injury or something that's just been caused by hitting him on the rocks and heaven knows what, I don't know.
A forlorn betting slip found in his trouser pocket is the only clue to who the man is, how he died.
You're going to dump someone, you dump them in the bushes or something, wouldn't you, up there or something, or wherever else, really. Because when you look at all this lot that's been washed up, it's obviously a good place, so everything's been washed up, isn't it, really? So I'm in the wrong place for the smell here. Okay, when you're ready, we'll try and do a full-length picture of him when he's on the sheet now, and then in a bit it'll be wrapped and off to the mortuary. Okay, that's job done. The body's obviously been all wrapped up now, and it's waiting for someone to actually lug it and up to the path, and it's a bit of a long journey back to the actual cars and roads, so a bit of a sweat work for somebody. Well, not me. No, I've got enough to carry. Right, off we go.
Another set of prints for the archive. The victims of Jack the Ripper are among the earliest examples of forensic photography, the primitive quality obscuring mercifully the full horror of the Ripper's technique. The case of Dr. Crippen saw a doubling of investment in the Yard's cumbersome half-plate cameras. The Home Office sanctioned the purchase of a second one. To record, for instance, in 1922, the contents of a trunk in left luggage at Charing Cross, which after 5 days aroused suspicion. Or, 30 years on, the macabre discoveries at a house in Notting Hill Gate belonging to John Christie, a mother and baby strangled in an outhouse, 6 more bodies walled up in the kitchen, under the floorboards or in the garden. 2 men were hanged. Was only one of them guilty? The ledger unemotionally records the daily catalogue of crime, but what does this mundane horror do to those whose job it is to look at it in close-up?
Most people, they know that if they're going to come into a police environment, taking photographs, you're going to meet dead bodies and it's going to be a bit stressful. You know, if you become a nurse, you're going to see some awful sights. If you become a doctor, you're going to see some awful sights. So I think it's because you condition yourself, knowing that you're going to be doing it, that it helps enormously. I think it's these people who are presented with it and they're totally unprepared for it. That's when stress really builds up, I think.
When I started, they tried to sort of break you in easy by giving you easier jobs, nice fresh bodies, rather than people that have been dead for a long time. And as time progresses, then the more the bodies tend to sort of be more decomposed, and you get used to it.
It was a call out one night to a murder of a young child, done by father. Mother wasn't in the picture at all, and he murdered the child and overdosed himself. But the house was sparse. Everything was put away. Everything was polished. And there was an old detective sergeant who would have known better there when I got there. And we were waiting for a senior officer to come. And he took me around and he showed me all the sort of life this kid had lived. And it played on my mind. I mean, your first one, you're bound to get that way. And when I'd finished, it wasn't a great shakes, you know, the amount of photographs and so on. I made my way home and got to bed. And I lay awake for the rest of the night thinking about this child's life. And I thought, well, there's a lesson in this. You don't get yourself too involved, you get into that state again. And I'm afraid that's the way I was from there on, if you like. You learn that lesson. I think it was a lesson.
The horror hasn't changed much. The techniques have, and so have the people. Jackie Bishop belongs to the digital age. Stills are fine for the forensic record, but these days they're supplemented by video.
Gonna sign me in. Gonna sign me back in.
It was meant to be Jackie's day off. She could have been taking a pleasant walk along the towpath at Stoke Newington in northeast London. Instead, she's coping with the ugly outcome of the neighbourhood's violent crime.
The stills have actually already been done, but they wanted a video too, so that obviously stills can't cover the whole path, whereas a video can. It can show distance easier than stills can. So we're just doing a bit of everything here.
Jackie's pictures will help the police build up a picture of how the crime was committed. For the prosecution, or maybe for the defence, her work may become critical to any future trial. A trial for murder.
We just have to film the body for evidence to see exactly where he's ended up and anything that might be around the body that's important.
Like a nightmare version of a high street happy snapshot store, all scene of crime photographs come to this central laboratory in South London. Crime in all its horror and banality churns unceasingly through the printer. Out of 500,000 images a year, half are of fingerprints.
What this is here is what we call lifts, because it's finger marks that have been lifted from a crime scene. What basically they do, if a fingerprint is found on an object, on glass or whatever, it's dusted with aluminium powder. For want of a better expression, it's a thing like sellotape is placed over that mark. It's lifted, it's placed onto an acetate sheet, which is a fixed size to fit this machine, which actually projects light through it onto photographic paper, so it's actually printing the mark that was left at the scene.
Fingerprint evidence was to crack one of the most dramatic crimes of the 60s, the £2 million Great Train robbery.
The superintendent in charge of photographic, Superintendent Cram at that stage, Scottish man, he had a very simple system of picking you to go to a crime scene. He sat in his office. When something major come in, if you happened to be passing the door, he'd shout, "Laddie, I've got a job for you." And you come, I'd heard that this was happening. Some people would run and hide when they heard there was a big job, but I was always quite keen to get involved. I sort of kept walking past his door till he suddenly called, "Laddie, I've got a job." We went straight up to the station where the train was, and I worked with the team. We'd covered various fingerprints, that sort of evidence. Came back from the engine, and then we got the call to Leatherslade Farm.
Leatherslade Farm was where the gang planned to hole up while the dust settled. But something seems to have panicked them into leaving the farm early. More importantly, leaving vital evidence behind.
We did every knife and fork, cup, the bath, everything was treated for fingerprints. Very primitive in those days, because all we had was powder and light, really, and fairly basic lighting. I photographed some 300 or 400 marks, I think, altogether. And most of the identifications were on finger marks.
Most of the time, the train robbers had worn gloves, but exhilarated by their exploit, they'd grown careless. Then, of course, there are some times when you just can't keep your gloves on.
Well remember another mark. I think it was the only mark for one of the suspects. There was a little inset chrome handrail on the bath. He must have had a bath, and on the inside of this chrome handrail there was a palm print. It was developed with powder, but of course in those days there was no lifting of finger marks. They all had to be photographed. So I spent an entire morning with a mirror wedged behind this chrome handrail, photographing the reflection with my camera, and me lying on my back in the bath to focus the camera. Because there was no small cameras in those days used for it. But as it was worth persevering, because I think that was the only mark that was actually identified for that suspect.
That suspect was Thomas Wisby. He was later sentenced to 30 years. Today's techniques have made the days of powder and light seem primitive indeed.
The mark is photographed using various light sources. It could be a ring light in this case. He's got a specular light there, and also fibre optic light, which is a very fine source of light which can be placed, to make the mark expose itself as good as possible, ready for photography. And this is what is happening here.
Forensic photography seemed to have closed the file on the Great Train Robbery. But it wasn't long before the photographic branch was involved again. Another of the robbers was serving his 30 years at Wandsworth Jail, or rather the first few months of them. Ronnie Biggs.
I got the call with Yorkie Hayes, who was one of the original police photographers, and I got deputed to go with him. Old George, he was delightful because sometimes he would forget and come to work in his carpet slippers. He was a lovely chap, and he said, "Oh, I'm not into climbing." He said, "You'll have to do this." And of course, when I got to Wandsworth Prison, I found out what he was talking about, because at the scene there was a removal lorry parked alongside the prison wall. And apparently Biggs and a few of his colleagues had come up the inside of the wall, and the wall was pointed on the top like this. It wasn't flat. It wouldn't be that easy. I suppose that's to stop people getting in and out. But they'd gone over the pointed top of the wall, and below them was a big furniture van with a hole cut in the roof. And what they did, they jumped through the hole in the roof onto a pile of mattresses inside, then got out the tailboard of the lorry, got into the waiting getaway car, and buzzed off. So, of course, when we got there, Yorkie Hayes and myself, we had this to photograph. And we did the scene with the lorry alongside the wall, and old Yorkie said, well, now it comes to thee, don't it? Up ladder, lad. And I had to go up the ladder and try and photograph in through the hole in the roof of the removal van. Well, the photographs, a scene of crime are there. And, of course, as you know, Biggs headed away to South America.
The job at the Stoke Newington Canal murder is almost done. Forensic photography involves more than merely recording the crime. The whole scene has to be preserved on celluloid, videotape or digital hard disk for any evidence that might help eliminate the innocent or incriminate the guilty.
Well, these are shoe marks on the toe part. They've come to somebody's attention and they've been marked up, and just in case they've got something to do with the investigation. So we're just photographing these two here, one here and one a little bit closer to the other exit as well, and just in case.
In the hierarchy of detection, the photographer has a special place. It's not until the pictures are safely in the can and the scene has been preserved that the other experts can do their job. And for sanity's sake, it has to be that, just a job.
It's just work. You can't be continually shocked by the same thing, by bodies and stuff. You switch off at the end of the day. You don't go home and dwell on it. There's not that many dead bodies floating around London, thank goodness.
There was a time, there was a place, where mutilation and murder were commonplace. The East End during the 50s and 60s. The reign of the gangland bosses.
There was more violent crime probably in the East End than there was anywhere else in London, and they always, albeit a bit gruesome, are the most interesting types of jobs, without question. And over the years, the big villains have all come from that area, haven't they? And GBH was quite common, and protection. I mean, there were days when you would do anything up to 7 or 8 GBH victims, especially over the weekend after a Friday night, If you got tanked up and got thumped. Yes, I think in the East End you behaved yourself, or else. I'm an East Ender.
The Cray brothers began as snooker hall bouncers at £5 a night. Protecting property grew into a business. Wrecking it if the dues weren't paid turned the business into an empire of extortion. In 1966, George Cornell walked into this pub. It was an act of brazen defiance. He was a member of a rival gang, and he'd called Ronnie Cray a puff.
When I got to the Blind Beggar, there was only a large pool of blood.
And a wall of silence.
You can imagine a crowded pub, somebody coming in, shooting someone, and nobody saw anything. Everybody in that pub must have seen what went on. And yet nobody would say a word, because they were absolutely feared, the Crays, they really were.
Cornell said to Ronnie Cray, "Well, look who's here." Ronnie shot him in the head. The Blind Beggar's bar staff were all inexplicably out the back at the time, returning just in time to deny all knowledge to the police.
pubs and policemen don't always go well together. And there were an awful lot of police officers all standing around in the bar or sitting down. Well, I obviously can't have anybody in the picture when I take it. But obviously they helped and they got out the way, went into the other bar, probably.
The blind beggar killing wasn't enough for the Krays. They took their old friend, Frank Mitchell, to a flat in East London after he'd been sprung from Dartmoor.
I gave evidence both at the Old Bailey and at Bow Street Magistrates Court of photographs I'd taken. In the first instance of the flat where they kept Mitchell, the Mad Axeman as he was called, and eventually killed him. I took photographs of the scene at the flat.
Mitchell got bored at the flat. He became a liability. He had to be killed. The violence went on.
And then, subsequently, at the Horns public house, true or false, the story goes that the man who owned the Horns, Krays, had thought he'd done a deed, and he lost his kneecaps or for something similar as a result of it. And then they found out it wasn't him, so they brought him the Horns pub. True or false, I wouldn't sort of like to say, but all the walls in one bar were lined with photographs of the Kray twins.
The Met's photographers don't glamorise crime. They know better than anyone that it is sordid and mundane. Even the Krays' chosen places of execution were drab.
Evering Road was just an ordinary residential street and an ordinary residential house, you know, so nothing remarkable about it.
Jack the Hat McVitie, he wore it to cover a bald spot, had failed to carry out a contract killing for the Krays. Worse, he hadn't paid them back their deposit. He was brought to Evering Road. Reggie stabbed him in the face with a kitchen knife. His gun had jammed.
And the gun was taken away and thrown in the river, or the canal, and subsequently dragged up, and it was found quite easily. There is one aside of the Krays. There's a gentleman called Ginger Marks. Have you heard of Ginger Marks? He went missing. Where he is now, I haven't got the least idea, and I don't think anybody else has, but he went missing, and everybody that was dragged out the Thames was Ginger Marks. If it was 6 foot wide, 6 foot tall, this is true. There was one that had been squashed under a barge going up and down with the tide, and he was 6 foot wide, and this was Ginger Marks, you know. Not one of them turned out to be Ginger Marks, I'm afraid to say. But it is thought that they had a hand in his demise, but whether that's true or not, I don't know.
These bleak images helped build the case against the Krays. They got life, with a recommendation of 30 years apiece.
I think I do remember also about that was the fact that when the only time that I've ever been under guard or taken under guard to the Old Bailey, we were all herded together in one of the city police stations and then escorted to the Old Bailey, kept in a separate room. And obviously this was because of threats to witnesses that have been made. But it's the only time it's ever happened to me.
In Part 3, the Lord Lucan murder. New photographs and a first-hand account of the scene from the man who took them.
Hang on, I'll just be with you in a minute. Oh. Just one sec.
Not all the subjects of the crime photographer are obligingly dead.
Who is it?
Recording injuries to victims, the police photographer has to make house calls.
Oh, it's bloody 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm very sorry. I've come to document your injuries, if that's okay. I was expecting you bloody 3 hours.
Dealing with victims calls for sensitivity and training. In this exercise, the photographer's personal skills are monitored.
All right. Yeah.
At the end of the role play, video playback will help improve techniques.
Okay.
I do appreciate it. I'll
see myself out, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much for your help.
Thanks for your time.
And I'll get someone to give you a call soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Steve, is it, yeah?
Yes, Steve.
Oh, thanks, Steve.
Okay, thanks very much.
Goodbye now.
Bye.
Well, 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 well. Another good one. Excellent. Very good indeed. That rapport going. And another full 10 out of 10 for getting the shots in the bag.
The crime photographer needs the speed and skills of the paparazzi, the forensic acumen of Inspector Morse, and the sensitivity of a social worker.
They want to know what's happening with my case. Why hasn't the perpetrator to this crime been caught?
Yeah.
And if there's no answer, if you come in and they see you as a member of the police service and you come up with a negative answer, I don't know, mate, then that's not going to be too good.
But no amount of training can prepare London's photographers for some of the scenes they're called out to.
They said, we've got to search the garden because we're looking for body parts. Arms, legs, a head, anything to go with this torso. So the chap said, as they would do, look, you, Mr. Photographer, you sit in the kitchen and wait while we go over the garden. It's going to take a long time. So I said, OK, fine, I didn't mind. So I was sitting in the kitchen there and they're out probing the garden with spades and shovels and everything else they can find. And while I'm sitting there, I'm looking at the cooker. And I've got a terrible ESP. It's got me into so much trouble over the years, you wouldn't believe it. But I thought, cooker, body, parts? No, it can't be. Anyway, I walked over to the pressure cooker, took the lid off, and it was full up with body parts, all partly cooked. So I thought, well, if there's something in the pressure cooker, is there something in the oven? So I opened the oven door, and lo and behold, on a big plate in there is a section of the leg from the hip to the knee, cooked and sliced. You can draw your own conclusions. Why would people cook a person? I don't know.
London's police photographers know that murder is no respecter of rank or privilege, either among its victims or its perpetrators.
There'd been a fatal accident at Hyde Park Corner, and I was just finishing off that, hoping to go home, and I was bleeped and said, asked to go to a scene very close by, and it turned out to be a murder scene. I don't think quite realised what it was at the time. It was rather a bizarre scene. Subsequently, I learned it was the Lord Lucan, the nanny in the sack crime.
The 7th Earl of Lucan had meant to kill his wife. In the dark, he murdered his children's nanny.
Well, it was quite a luxurious flat, and from what I remember, the actual body was sort of downstairs in the passageway at the bottom of the stairs. It is a small sack, and it does seem incredible that a body can be put in a sack of that size. I followed the search for Lord Lucan, when it's been reported in the paper since, really, with a bit of added interest, I suppose.
In a recent year, the branch's anonymous South London headquarters dispatched its 30 full-time photographers to cover more than 2,500 suspicious death scenes, murders, suicides, or the simply unexplained.
Basically, this is really the ops room, so we get consistently various jobs coming in, all sorts. Some of actually were originally on division, but now because they haven't got the resources, have come back to us. We have to assign really the most practical option to respond to that call. Obviously, in theory, it would be the closest person, but that may not always be practical, so they may be pre-assigned to a job, so then effectively the next available person will be assigned. It's feast or famine. It can vary. We just don't know what's going to happen. Anything can happen. Literally anything can happen at any time.
Tonight, Bob Campbell's on his way to a suspicious death.
I don't know how many suspicious deaths and murders I've done, but hundreds, literally hundreds, if not thousands. People often say to me, what's the worst job you've ever been to? And I couldn't really say, really. My memory is very short. I do a horrific murder on a Monday, and by the Wednesday I've forgotten about it, really.
It's a busy night. Jackie Bishop's been called out to Vauxhall Bridge. What began as a traffic offence has turned into a serious criminal case.
This car has been stopped on a routine search. When they went to search the vehicle, they found 2 guns in the passenger footwell. Suspects inside then decamped, one of whom jumped over the bridge straight into the Thames and apparently is now in St Thomas's being dried out. Not a good night to be jumping in the Thames, I don't think. We're just waiting for them to open the passenger well so I can photograph the guns in there, and then one of the guns team will come along and prove the guns and make sure that they're safe before they transport it.
Bob's got to the housing estate in East London, scene of the suspicious death. The suit will prevent him contaminating the scene. Often it's useful to prevent the scene contaminating him.
Body's been there for some days, so I know that the body's going to be well deteriorated and pretty smelly, you know. But that's something I've got to put up with that won't show in the photographs.
At times like this, the police photographer lets his technique and experience take over, blocking out all other distractions.
On a job like this, I tend to ignore the bodies until sort of last and photograph the rest of it first. At least there's lighting here, but I mean, sometimes I've been in premises where you're actually, it's just you in the darkness and the body. I do remember one job I went to, which was one of the most, it did give me a bit of a fright. It was at a suspicious death in a flat where a man set light to the place as well, so it was an arson and a sort of death. And I was taking photographs in this bedroom, in total darkness, multi-flash. And when you fired off the first flash, suddenly you saw this pair of piercing eyes looking at me from underneath the bed. And I did give it a bit of a fright, but it turned out it was a guy's Alsatian dog.
Jackie's nearly through with her assignment on Vauxhall Bridge.
Okay, so yours. Yeah, I'm just going to wait for them to prove it and see if they want any shots of the bullets in the barrel at all. But we'll just wait for them. Yeah, if you can just put one there and the other one next to it and then the rounds next to that, that'd be lovely. That's great. When it's in a footwell, a photograph, it's difficult to gauge what size they're going to be. So what we do is we actually have a scale ruler that we put it next to, and it just gives an idea of what size they actually are.
There's only one light bulb in there and it's flickering, so if it goes, we'll all be in darkness.
The East London death is becoming less suspicious by the minute. Just a bleak, lonely, final act of despair.
At the top is actually put a rope around just an ordinary cupboard door. In fact, actually looks as if there's several pieces of rope. It's a bit of a hodgepodge of rope and flex. It's quite surprising, actually. You all stay together and you managed to achieve the result you wanted. His feet are actually on the floor, so obviously stretched quite a lot.
Every year, the photographic branch attend more than 20,000 scenes of crime. Add to that 600 post-mortems and other occasions when the merely sinister merges into black comedy.
It was one wet, miserable day, and I was going through Harleston, and I got a call on the radio to go to Kensal Green Cemetery. Didn't say what the job was at all. So I drove down to the cemetery entrance and met a police car with a young PC in it, who said, "Oh, hello there. Yeah, follow me." So I picked up my gear and walked through this cemetery. And Kensal Green Cemetery is totally overgrown. And we arrived at this Victorian mausoleum, and the door had been forced open. And the PC said, "Oh, it's in there." I didn't know what was in there. So I walked in there. And right in front of me were 3 open coffins. And each one had had a stake nailed through the heart of the decomposed body. So I turned around and said jokingly, "Oh, we obviously need look no further. It's Count Dracula." I turned around and he'd actually disappeared, the PC. He'd done a runner, and I was left there. So in those days we had cameras that you had to put a dark cloth over your head to sort of to focus up with. And so I was left there underneath this dark cloth, holding a lamp, and just as I was about to take the photograph, there was an almighty crash of thunder, and the rain came bucketing down, and it's the fastest set of photographs I have ever taken, and I was out there in a flash. I thought, Hammer horror movies have got nothing on this.
In part 4, another killing in the capital. However much the city's changed, London is still the capital of Britain's crime. The robbers may work from computer terminals these days, the new gangland empires may be based on drugs and money laundering, but human nature and private passions remain defiantly the same.
There was a lady in Fulham who was killed by her husband. I can't remember the exact cause of the row which ended up in her death. But anyway, what happened was she was cut up. And I think he cut her arms and legs off and head and so on, and distributed parts of the body into roadside skips and things like that. Anyway, it came to light that she'd been killed, and they tried to figure out what had happened to the body. And they said, well, we're pretty sure that at least the torso was taken on a skip. And the system in London, even today, is to take all the rubbish from London down the river on barges, and it's taken to a place called Mucking at Thurrock in Essex. And there's a huge landfill site there of about 500 acres where all the domestic waste is put in, a big hole's dug in the ground. Anyway, they said, well, we think this woman's body has gone down to Mucking. Would you go down there with a search crew and see if you can find it? So I thought, well, this is a bit much, And when we got down there, you see a place of that size with rubbish as far as the eye can see, 15 or 20 feet deep. Where do you start? Well, fortunately, the pit manager, they keep a record of where every day's tipping goes. So he said, well, I think you'll find some of the body here. So the officer in the case had a digger hired, one of these massive, great crane diggers. And for the first day, we dug away piles and piles and piles of this evil-smelling stuff. It was, you can't imagine it. It's got everything in it. It's black, it's gooey, it's sticky, it stinks. And having dug through quite a bit of that, towards the end of the day, in the wall of where we were digging, a black thing stuck out, and the chap said, look, there's an arm. We filmed this, and we took it out. Yes, it was an arm. Next day, we did the same thing again, shifting tons and tons of rubbish, and we found the torso. And another day, we found the leg, but that was as far as it went. That was all we got back. Eventually, the chap was charged with his wife's murder. But we got it all back except for the head and one arm. But the spin-off for me was that I found a place of 500 acres alongside the Thames, which was a wilderness of wildlife. And it was a place that I hadn't seen since I was a youngster. So I fell in on my feet there, and I was allowed from then on to go back there bird watching, and it was very, very good from that point of view.
Has crime changed over the years? Chris Lewis has been called out for what's become an almost routine event.
We're in Streatham, We come to a scene of a double murder. 2 suspects go to a flat. There's been some sort of altercation, and there's 2 other people in the flat, and 2 people ended up dead.
It's got much more violent. In the old days, if there was a punch-up, it was literally a punch-up. They get square up to each other and hit each other, but now they pick up the first thing that comes to hand. They seem to do it at a drop of a hat now.
This is basically the flat where the murders happened. We're just going to follow the blood trails up from here.
It looks like a gang murder over drugs. A commercial killing.
The ones I remember doing were all sort of one-to-one. You know, it was a knife or a gun at close quarters or that sort of thing. It seemed to be very much personal. Today it seemed to be a little more impersonal.
There seems to be shootings every weekend now. It's not weekdays, and when this is only a Thursday night. When you actually do it for a profession, I think it sort of knocks the stuffing out of you, and you look for other hobbies to do.
The capital's 81st murder of the year, and it's still only July.
I think where there's people, there's crime. People get themselves into situations and panic and make the situation worse. I mean, if we all had a chance to step back from a situation and look at the best way to deal with it, we'd all be better people, but that never happens.
Crime affects us all, even the detached professional observer.
There's 1 or 2 things that, I mean, especially with children, no one likes to see that. I've got one of my own coming soon, so you think of your own families when you see stuff like that, and, you know, not so much that, even adults, you know, there's someone's fathers, brothers, mothers, aunts, uncles, you know.
Once I got married, once I got kids of my own, and then I think that's when things really started to come into it. Then you think, yes, there is more to life, and okay, life seems cheap to a lot of people because they go around killing people willy-nilly ad infinitum. I've always said it'll get worse before it gets better, but throughout the 30-odd years, it has got worse, and it hasn't got any better.
Police are still investigating the murders in Streatham. Several arrests have been made. The body on the foreshore has been identified. Why he died is still a mystery. The CID's Serious Crime Group is still investigating the case of the murder in Stoke Newington. The suicide had no next of kin. Next week on Shooting the Crime, the Siege Busters. Police photographers have a ringside seat as the SAS storm the Iranian embassy.
And that'll be at the earlier time of 11:05.